Hello everyone, my name is Dorothy Doomfum, founder of Law City, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Law City Uncut, the podcast packaging inspiration and bringing it to the doorsteps of those who need it the most. We're bringing you real life stories, uncut, from the sharpest minds within the legal industry. So sit back, relax, grab a drink, and enjoy the conversation. Hello, Bilal. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. It's a privilege to have you with us here today. I am inspired by your story, but not necessarily your achievements or your success so far. I think more so your journey and the fights that you had to overcome to get to where you are today. So tell us a bit about you. For those of our audience who don't know you, who is Bilal?
Well, I'm very flattered that you have me, and thank you for having me. So I'm Bilal. I'm currently a senior legal counsel at the Royal Bank of Canada in their wealth management team. And going back in time before that, I was head of legal at China Construction Bank, which is Asia's biggest bank. And prior to that, I was a banking and finance lawyer in what we now call A&O Sherman.
Yeah.
And university for me was Nottingham, and went to school in Walthamstow, East London.
Awesome. So I know that you were born to an immigrant family and you actually lived in a single bed flat. Talk to us about that experience. It was in East London, right?
Yeah, it was Walthamstow. Chingford down Walthamstow. So, it was good. I didn't know any better, right? So it was great. The 4 flights of stairs without lifts, which never worked, seemed to be normal for me.
Right.
And it was late 80s and early 90s, so it was still quite, it was very white East London, but actually it was still much of a community. People looked after each other. It was really nice. The things that I remember more, the flat was the flat and it wasn't great. It was actually moving into my parents, where they still live, into the first house. It's a 3-bedroom terrace. And I think what people do now is it's like when they do well, they buy a new home, they gut the place out, they get an architect in, they do it up. It's really nice. My parents couldn't afford to renovate. So we were living on floorboards and mattresses for about 6 months or a year. But the important thing for them was to scale up and to kind of get their grounding, get their footing, get me near schools that they wanted me to. And so they were willing to make that sacrifice. So most of my youth was kind of kitchens without doors on them, and kind of that was just life. So that's the things I remember. But to me and everyone around me, that was kind of normal. It wasn't anything else you knew. It was only until really that I moved away from my state school, where I did okay, to my 6th form, that I started seeing the difference and gap of inequality or empowerment and all those things.
Staying on inequality and the lack of exposure, I often speak about the fact that I grew up in Croydon, and I remember the conversations in the playground. It was never about who was going to be the next prime minister or whose dad was a partner at a firm or who was going to be the next millionaire. It was often about crime or relationships and stuff like that. There was just a lack of exposure, right? So growing up in a single bed flat, how did you have time to dream? Did you have time to dream? And if you did, what did you dream about?
I mean, the things I do remember was I wanted to be the Undertaker. That was the thing that I was obsessed about. When people ask me, what did you want? Did you always want to be a lawyer? It's I wanted to be a professional wrestler until I realized I couldn't be. And that was because it was a normal childhood, and you're exposed to people from all walks of life.
Exactly.
And like yourself, my state school, the conversations we had were, are we going to pass our exams? What if we get kicked out? It was all very negative and cynically based, or pessimistic. I went to a good 6th form because I got good grades, and everyone there was more middle class, more of their parents had gone to university. And the questions they were asking were, which university am I going to? What am I going to do on my gap year? What career do I want? And it was the difference between the two was this sense of empowerment. And in terms of when we talk about dreaming or thinking or aspiring, the difference between the two was that sense of empowerment. There's skills-wise, no difference. It was entirely about their environment and people around them saying, it's not only okay for you to dream, it's kind of normal. So in terms of when you talk about dreams or aspirations, for most people, it was just getting to the next day, getting to the next year, not failing, not falling off the edge. And then the shift becomes about empowerment is, there's a big wide world and what am I going to do with it?
I want us to stick on the conversation of empowerment. And you mentioned, the difference between people from more affluent backgrounds to those from less disadvantaged backgrounds, let's say. One thing I realized within the legal industry is for the people who have come from more affluent backgrounds, the conversation of leadership or success is almost a sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
Whereas for us, or those who have come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, for example, all we have is a dream. And then it's then up to us to find mentorship or good leaders or people who can allow us to turn that dream into a reality. So I know you said you wanted to be the undertaker. At what point did that conversation switch from that to law? And what were the tools or were there mentors along the way who helped you turn that dream into a reality?
So I think for me, it's probably around year 9, 10 or something, where people started to think about jobs and careers and what you wanted to do. Lots of my friends had parents who had a business. It would be like a local mechanic or running a meat shop or a local SME nearby. And so for many of them, it was, well, I'm just going to go and do that and work at the shop for a bit. My dad didn't do that. So for me, it was, well, what did I want to do next? I was mouthy, right? In the nicest possible way, but I was reasonably charming about it. And I do remember some of the teachers saying, you could talk for England. And then we had a new deputy head come in, and she was very thoughtful, and she really saw the students in a way that perhaps others hadn't seen them before. She saw them fresh, and she's like, have you ever thought about being a lawyer? And it did feel like, well, look, it sounds like a fun job, but I think also there was something subconsciously about me thinking, this is a stable job. This will provide for me. This will provide for my parents. We grew up with a lot of financial uncertainty. There were months where, they never really told me about this, but it was very obvious that they weren't going to make more mortgage payments or something like that. So there was always those moments. So I think for many people from a disadvantaged background, and I'd probably go further as well, people from an ethnic minority background, there's almost a default position of like, I just want to be stable. And that sense of professional jobs, when you come in, like my parents would be like, oh, being a lawyer, you're set for life. Like, that's not necessarily true, but yes, there's a stability that you get from this. It kind of drives your decision making. So being the undertaker or going into the professional arts or becoming an artist or an entrepreneur back then, you almost self-select yourself out of it. It's too risky. You're not sure how it's going to end up. You want a safe bet. So I think that kind of groups it down to the kind of classics of medicine, doctor, accountant, engineer, right? So that we all, those were the 4 that you kind of picked from. But I did get a sense of, I liked talking, I liked engaging with debate and argument. And, people kind of would always come to me and kind of like ask me advice and things like that. It was a counsel role. And I think those things meant that it felt like a good idea. When I did talk to people about it in the career service, the instant response was, have you thought about working in social services? Have you thought about, if you did want to be a lawyer, maybe being a paralegal? Have you thought about being a barrister's clerk? It was never just you should go do that. It was very much think about law, think law adjacent. And it's not, it's not a criticism of them. I think just by kind of likelihood probability, a lot of people would have been in that area. But I suppose the one benefit of not having anyone in the law was that I didn't know what my boundaries were. I didn't know what the problems were. You just kind of went in blind. And there is something I think to be said about that sometimes, just going for it without having any aware of it. Sometimes you do so much research, it puts you off doing anything. Sometimes just going with it and figuring it out. And they're like, oh, I wasn't supposed to do that. And you just end up doing it anyway.
I like that. Was that the same with, I know you were the first in your family to go to university, so was that the same idea when you went to university, just go for it and see where...
Yeah, kind of. I think my parents I love them very much, but they were also very focused on making sure that I do well, making sure that I have a stability for myself. And I think for most parents who haven't gone to university, they have either 2 presets. The first is they only know what they see on TV or whatever. So for my dad, there was Oxford and Cambridge, there was nothing else. And for my mum, she just didn't want to leave me to leave the home.
Right.
So when it was Nottingham, which was a great law school and I'm very happy, it was a great place, for my dad, there was a whole conversation of, I'm not just going to a college, it's a real university. These are the things that you can do with it. And there was a kind of almost an education process for him there. For my mum, it was very much, and so I'm an only child, for her it was very much like her life was changing. It was almost managing her to say, I'm still your son, I'm still not going.
Be fine.
But I think particularly because we went through such hardships together, and again, from a traditional cultural value basis, for my mum, it was strange to see her children leave home before starting their own family. And again, nobody around her, like my grandmum, her mum, 3 of her daughters, her sisters still live with her till old age. So it was and they only lived 2 roads down.
Yeah.
So it was very natural for the family just to stay very close together. So the challenges it was never a challenge like, I want to go to uni. There was never that fight. It was, which uni am I going to in terms of distance and kind of recognition? And I would imagine that most people who are watching this as well probably have something similar. It's never a case of, I don't think any parent, and I'm a parent now, your kid says to you, you want to go to a university. You're never like, oh, that's a terrible idea. I think it's much more about, does it work for you? Does the course work for you? Are you going to be okay? Those are the conversations more than anything else.
Right. Your career is remarkable. I know you touched on it briefly before. You were a banking lawyer at A&O Sherman, head of legal at China Construction Bank. You ran for Parliament twice for the Labour Party. I know you're probably over the moon about the recent results.
I'm relieved more than anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
And then now you're Senior Counsel at the Royal Bank of Canada. Not many people from disadvantaged backgrounds gain access to the legal industry, let alone thrive within it. What do you think sets you apart? What makes you different? Why have you lasted for so long?
So, I don't think I thrive, right? I am constantly looking at, you went to A&O and there's about 120 of us. And we all kind of stay in touch and kind of keep track. And it's a good indicator of like the legal career. I look at some of my peers and be like, why aren't I doing what they're doing? And on the parliamentary side, very good friends of mine, we were like door knocking since 2015. 2 of them just got announced to being ministers of state. I'm like, why didn't they do that? You're never, if you're ambitious or you're driven, you're always driven. And if you're pushed by me, what I'm pushed by largely is imposter syndrome, right? Like I need to keep moving because then I will be just sucked under to kind of poverty or obscurity or whatever it is that scares us. Even at 40, I'm still thinking about that. So when it's very nice of you to say that, and I'm flattered, but I see a very different thing of like, I should be here, or I should be pushing a bit more. That itself comes with, it's unfair on myself and actually can take a toll. So there's a drive. In terms of what keeps me going and why have I gotten to do what I've done, I was extraordinarily lucky, but A&O was a big launch pad. I think when you go through your career, you should be conscious of what your selling points are.
Right.
Whether that's a good uni, whether it's your grades, whether it's a passion that you have.
What were your selling points?
So for me, it was debating. I got involved in schools debating. I loved it. I was good at it. I was scouted to be on the England debate team, so I got onto the British debate squad at university. I toured the world, coaching debate around the world. I also, before university, took a year off and set up a debate mentor program. So it's a charity. It reached out to about 10,000 young people in East and South East London, and it would mentor them to people or students at University of London, Oxford and Cambridge. Every week, those mentors would go to their school, coach them debate. We ran debate competitions for about 15 years. And it was a way of people without a voice finding their voice. It was a way for them to critically listen and think. I was deeply passionate about it. I learned a lot about how to run an organization. I learned a lot about myself. And I think that was the thing that I would focus on. So I was just Mr. Debate. So that passion really bled through in, I think, my interviews, in what got me to A&O. Also for me, I took a year abroad in the States, in Virginia. And I think that really just kind of opened my eyes up to living outside the UK a lot, working outside the UK a lot, studying with lots of Americans made me just a more kind of gregarious, outward person. And so those two parts of my life, which was the Virginia story and the debating story, were the things that I think got me into A&O. And then from there, every time you move on, you're like, well, what's the story? What's the narrative? What are my... Because the grades or the school, they're great and they're important, but they just get the conversation. And then the conversation is, well, what are you doing for me?
Yeah. You mentioned imposter syndrome. I think that is common, especially amongst high achievers, right? And often you think that it gets better the more senior you get, but by the sounds of it, it doesn't. It just, you get to a new level.
But yeah, I don't think so. I think that friends of mine who've gone through similar experiences, we talk about it. I don't think it gets any better. I think it gets different.
Okay.
I think we get perspective. I think once you start maybe a family or your own side hustle or things like that, the need to be validated by your sole job or your career kind of dissipates. You get your relationships, you get your family, all those things kind of take away from it, and that's good because it's a healthy, full-rounded person. In terms of the drive, I think what does happen is you go through kind of, I don't think a career is like this straight line up.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of this roller coaster of up. You kind of level off for a few years, and you kind of, because that's the point where you think, well, what do I want to do next, and where am I, and what matters to me. And for all of us, especially post-lockdown and especially post-COVID, we're so much more keen about balancing our home life with our work life.
Yeah.
So for me, it's really important that I still work, but at 3 or 4 o'clock, I'll go home, pick my kids up, we'll spend time together. When they're in bed, if I need to log back on and do the work, I'll do so. And so that matters to me more than necessarily the next title and necessarily a bigger increase in salary. Those things would be nice, but the priority is
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. By 2030, we aim to be recognized globally as a leader platform connecting people from underrepresented backgrounds to the legal industry. We also plan and aim to partner with up to 100 law firms and organizations in order to provide tailored programs and events and internships that cater specifically to aspiring lawyers from those socioeconomic backgrounds. And last but not the least, we aim to invest up to £10 million in mentorship, sponsorships, working on the development and training of aspiring lawyers from low socioeconomic backgrounds. I want you to look at your neighbour and just say to your neighbour, you belong in the legal industry. I need you to look in their eyes and make sure that they know that you believe it and say you belong in the legal industry. Our next segment is called Unpack the Quote.
Yeah.
And this is when I give you a quote and I just want you to tell me what you think straight off the bat. Okay. So the quote is, diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice we make every day. As leaders, we have to put out the message that we embrace and not just tolerate diversity. What do you think about that?
So a lot of us do work around the DEI space, and it feels like to me there's a 3-part story, which is diversity is the acknowledgement of the world that we exist, and part of that acknowledgement is that it's systemically unfair, and that it's not just about celebrating each other's differences, but it's also acknowledging that those come with disadvantages.
Yeah.
The inclusion part of that is how do we fix the problem? And that's by being inclusive, making sure that we each other are seen. And I think that's the thing that people, when the critics come about diversity inclusion, it's just like, it's not just about celebrating, it's about finding a way and space to make sure that people see each other. And then the final bit, which is the equity part, is getting everybody to their best versions of themselves. So I think that the DEI part is a 3-part story of acknowledging, seeing, doing something about it, eventually creating a more holistic world. There is a different part of it that we don't always talk about, particularly in corporate environments, is this is the DEI space, but we don't talk about the anti-racism space, which is very distinct, which is much more about challenging what we see on the street, what we see necessarily in politics, about not just unconscious biases, but kind of microaggressions as well. Like that's the stuff that also needs to be tackled. And the DEI space is more kind of the positive part of that story. But there is a part, and I think corporations do have a part to play in this when it comes to anti-racism, of challenging microaggressions and pay gaps and things like that. And those are difficult conversations, but actually are fundamental because that enhances the DEI space.
Right. So you're Senior Counsel at Royal Bank of Canada. What do you do on a day-to-day basis to make sure that the environment is more inclusive?
Sure. So there's almost all organisations now have some form of something called an ERG, which is an employment resource group. So when you go to university, imagine like your old student kind of different societies you'd be part of. It's kind of like that. It's a space where people from another background, whether it be the LGBT space, ethnic minorities, people with dependency care, or gender-based, meet together, hold events, hold learnings, kind of try and campaign internally for improvements so that everybody can be seen by their authentic selves. So I'm part of the ERG called Mosaic. It's focused on ethnic minorities. We focus on holding events, from Black History Month, but also Holocaust Memorial Day. We're also planning to do an event on Islamophobia Awareness Month. We're also thinking of doing trying to do a tie-in event with the LGBT ERG to highlight the story of ethnic minorities who are also in the queer space. So all of those are to allow people to see that everybody can work here, everybody's valued here. So on a day-to-day basis, I'm actually doing a bit of work on that quite regularly. And I may get into occasional trouble on this, but I will call things out if I see things that aren't, aren't, not necessarily for me, sometimes it's for allyship, and it'll be a quiet word to say, that probably wasn't the most appropriate thing in the world to say. Do we think that was the right thing to be said and heard? I think the final thing is just being quite present. Like I'm conscious of the fact that I am a big brown man with a beard walking in the city of London, which is relatively rare, particularly at senior level. So it's you're conscious of that. You kind of, whether you like it or not, you do need to carry yourself in a way to say, look, I need to present myself in a way that I am seen, I'm noticed, and visible. Yeah.
I think that visibility is key because it's one thing to be diverse, and I think we see diversity more at entry level. We rarely see it at senior level. So it's always important for those who have reached those heights to not only be visible, but also be authentic so that people who come after them don't feel like they have to fit a certain shape or be a different person in order to fit into an environment. So I'm glad that you said that. So we've heard your story, right? But the young girl from Peckham or the young boy from Brixton might be listening to this and think, he's special. What can I do to be like him? So I want us to make it a bit more practical, right? What are the principles that you have lived by that have aided your career development or career advancement today?
To the person in Peckham, don't be me, right? Like, I'm struggling with myself.
Right.
I want someone else with that burden. I think it's easy for me to say all this stuff now because I've got 20 years of experience. But starting out, like I remember, it is hard. You're wading through this sea that no one's ever taught you to navigate.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're doing is right. You don't know if you should be doing this. You see other people seeming to do it seamlessly. I think there's a couple of things I say. The first is, I don't think there is such a thing as a right decision. I think it's about making your decisions right. Whatever it is you want to do.
Let's go back. Okay. What does that mean?
It means focusing and leaning into whatever it is you want to do. Very often people would come up to me and say, I'm thinking of doing these courses or these subjects at uni, or what do you think? Or I'm thinking of doing these A-levels. It doesn't matter. Honestly, largely it doesn't. What matters is that you learn from it, you can prove that you've done well from it, and you get a good grade from it. Same thing with your courses. I mean, yes, there are, David Beckham studies, with the greatest respect to him, probably isn't the most valuable degree in the world. but should I do English? There is really a degree called the David Beckham. There's a whole,
No way.
yeah, there is a David Beckham studies.
What do they learn on?
They learn about David Beckham.
Wow.
It's a whole degree.
I think
they've
I
got
might do that
Yeah,
degree
people.
itself.
I'm sure you get masters on it. So there's them, but then there's like, oh, do I do English? Do I do history? Do I do maths? It's whatever it is at that time that you are passionate about. You find, well, not even passionate. You find interesting, and you're engaged because that's what you can show to people. And then the reason why you make your decisions right is because that's your authentic self. I think when people are trying to get a job and you've got 100 CVs where they are essentially the same grades more or less, the same types of unis more or less, you want somebody that you can engage with. And somebody once taught me, my old recruiting partner said, you want somebody when you hire them that you can put in front of your best client without you being in the room. And you want somebody that you could stand being with for 18 hours a day because you probably will. That's really what it boils down to. I mean, the other stuff is kind of, this is the standard stuff. It's people who are authentic, who are engaged. I wouldn't say likable because, liking somebody is quite subjective, right?
Yeah.
But it's about this person is their own self and they're, excuse me, somebody who you put in front of a good client, somebody you want to work with. And I think when you do this stuff, put yourself through that position of, do I come across in the way that I want to? Because you coming across as an authentic self is your most likable version. Putting on airs and graces, being somebody you're not, it's false, it's rigid. Everybody senses that.
Yeah.
And so it's just the version of you will just seep through and it shines. It really does. And you see it in interviews all the time. But the other thing I would say is have a thing. Whatever it is a thing. Mine was debating. And then debating then moved into social mobility, and then social mobility moved to campaigning, and that moved to Labour. It's a thing that means that you could talk about for 30 minutes unprompted.
Yeah.
If you don't have that thing, you should try and find something like that.
Join someone else's thing.
Figure something out. Take time for yourself and figure out what makes you tick, because you are an interesting person. You just haven't found your... And once you find it, have that thing and talk about it.
Yeah.
For many people, it's often sport. For people, it's charity. But the one thing that I'm conscious of for people who want to start off in any sort of career now compared to when I did it is, for better or worse, I think you need a branding pretty early on. Whether you either go completely black out on social media, or you are very focused and it's very procured and it's cultivated. It's really tough for people now because I can barely deal with my own life, creating an online version of myself, keeping that going, keeping that branding up. It's really hard work. But, if you're in the game, you're in the game. And I think the branding thing you do need to be conscious of, and it goes to the authentic self. If you're authentic, that stuff will bleed through. There is nothing wrong with having no online presence.
Do you think, even in this day and age?
I genuinely, I think there's an air of mystery. I was like, I can't find on LinkedIn, who is this person? Like, you genuinely find that. But I think that it's either, if you do it, you've got to do it well enough.
Yeah.
If you don't do it, I think it's not a bad thing. They're just like, I couldn't find them.
But I know before every client meeting we look on LinkedIn.
Yeah, you will.
So do you think, especially if you're starting out, right? Don't you think it's important to have a personal brand, or do you think it's not, or even an online presence, or do you think?
It's a really good question. I don't know the full answer. I think my views are that you can do it badly, right? And it's better not to do something than do it badly.
Yeah.
If you do it, you've got to do it well, and doing it well is quite hard. It's not impossible, but I think you have to be quite lucky, and all sorts of things have to work for you. So if you're going to do it, make sure you curate it in a proper way as possible. And to that end, I think, less is more. Having a good LinkedIn profile is great.
Yeah.
Having a LinkedIn profile, a TikTok channel, a YouTube, that for public consumption, that's a lot to keep up with. Like if you've got all those things, they're on private, whatever, that's fine. That's different. That's your own personal life. But outward facing, I'd say pick one or two avenues, whether that be Twitter or X and LinkedIn, whether it be Insta and LinkedIn, which seems to be the main ones. Pick one, and just really run with them, and then kind of make them the best version of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights and your story has been absolutely enlightening. What is next for you?
So for me, when we were talking about that kind of gradient, I think I'm in that plateau where work is going well. I've been there for a couple of years. It's what's the next step for me. But the next 5 to 10 years, like I'll be 50 in the next in the next 10 years. That's the point largely, I think, where people's careers are like, this is what it's going to be like until you try. So you've got one last push to get you to the place and position that's probably most interesting professionally, in terms of, the politics and all the other stuff. It's just a really interesting place right now. Lots to do, lots to uncover. It's quite nice. It's almost like going back to the beginning of my career in a weird way, because there's so many opportunities and you just meet people, you talk to them. There's almost an entrepreneurial spirit. You just kind of figure out what you can do.
Yeah.
So, and in a good way, I don't know the answer. And it's quite exciting.
Yeah.
And on the law side, it's like I can probably see where I need to be. And it's about making those connections, making sure the stars aligned. And the other thing I would say is that it actually gets harder the higher up you get. In the beginning, it's like there are lots of you, but there are lots of the positions.
Yeah.
So you kind of keep funneling and funneling. And as time goes on, you become more and more expertise. You become more specialized. Which is great, but it also means the spaces for you are fewer.
Yeah.
So you've got to find the right place and the right jumping board. And you've also got to ask yourself, well, the next step I take, don't think about that, think about the step after. Because if I go to a job now, it pays 50 grand more, fantastic, but no one's ever heard of it, the job sounds horrible, and I'll probably last for 3 years. What are you going to do next? And people look at your CV and you were like, you went from here to there? Like, that's a hard story to tell.
Yeah.
You've got to think about your stories and your CV in a narrative. You've got to explain it. You've got to weave a tale of like, this is where I've come from, this is where I'm going, because that's what recruiters and employers think about.
Great. Thank you so much, Bilal. It's been amazing having you with us today, and see you in the future.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you have found that conversation valuable. But 3 things from me. Stay curious, keep dreaming, and last but not the least, follow us on our social media handles below. See you on the next episode of Law City Uncut.